Anthony Joshua and Charles Martin have just weighed in ahead of their IBF heavyweight title clash tomorrow night. Joshua tipped the scales at 17 stone 6 pounds, which is 244 pounds. And Martin tipped the scales at 17 stone 7 pounds, which is 245 pounds. So both guys have come in at their normal fighting weight. There had been some speculation, which I'd seen online by various people, that Anthony Joshua was going to slim down for this fight against Charles Martin. Obviously, he's not carrying any body fat, but people were speculating that he was going to lose some muscle and come in lighter to gain some extra speed because he looked a bit stiff and slow against Dillian Whyte. People had posted pictures online and said, look, Joshua looks much slimmer. To me, he didn't look any slimmer. I don't know what people were looking at. You know, sometimes when someone is wearing a certain item of clothing, like a particular type of top or whatever, it can make them look slimmer than they actually are. If the picture is taken from a certain angle, it can make them look slimmer, etc., etc., which is what I said to these people. I said, look, you can't really tell nothing from those photos. If he is any slimmer, you can't really tell. You know, you would need to see him at the weigh-in or whatever to really be able to see if there was any significant reduction in his muscle mass at all. So yeah, he hasn't lost any weight. He's only a pound less than he was against Dillian Whyte. So it's basically going to be the same Anthony Joshua, at least from a physical point of view. From a technical point of view, he's going to have improved if he wants to win this fight and win it comfortably. He's, can't be as reckless as he was against Dillian Whyte. Charles Martin is a better counterpuncher than Dillian Whyte. He's a southpaw, and that left hand that Charles Martin has is sneaky. I've watched a few of Martin's fights. He's an unspectacular fighter, but one thing I can say is the left hand he has does have some speed on it. He does have some power on it, and he's sneaky with it. He likes to throw it as a counter. So Joshua's going to have to be aware of that and watch out. And in the build up to this fight, I watched a lot of interviews, Charles Martin interviews, Joshua interviews, and it's clear that Joshua is extremely confident. This is the most confident I've ever seen Joshua going into any fight, and he's always confident. But before this fight, it almost seems like it could be spilling over into overconfidence. Is he being contemptuous of Charles Martin? He said in one of the interviews that Charles Martin is not in his league. It's not really what you want to hear going into your first world title fight, that he's not in his league. He's already talking about fights with David Haye and Tyson Fury. Going into his first world title fight against Charles Martin, he's talking about fighting Haye and Fury. Again, that to me is not the way that Anthony Joshua should be thinking. Has Anthony Joshua finally succumbed to all the adulation he's been getting from the public? Has it finally gotten to him? Has his head finally got gassed and he hasn't been able to stay humble, as he likes to say all the time, stay humble? Because as I've said many times, Joshua's a young guy and he's been thrust into the limelight and he's getting all this adulation and praise. You would have to have a pretty incredible personality and a pretty incredible head on your shoulders to not get gassed up and end up with an overinflated ego in a situation like that, especially when you're young. If you're an older guy, if you come into boxing late and you maybe start having some success in your mid-30s, late 30s, you're more mentally mature by then. And it's not going to be as, the situation is not going to be as perilous for you. You'll be able to take the adulation and all that and be philosophical about it and take it in your stride much more easily than you would when you're a young guy. Your testosterone level's high. You got girls throwing themselves at you. You've got everybody kissing up to you, telling you you're amazing, and you're knocking people out in the ring. It's very difficult to keep your feet on the ground under those circumstances. Has Anthony Joshua finally just totally gone off the edge and started believing his own hype? And will that backfire against him here against Charles Martin? I believe that Anthony Joshua has the better pedigree than Charles Martin. He's obviously the better athlete. I think he's stronger. And I think he's actually proven more as a professional. He's definitely proven more as an amateur. I think he's also proven more as a professional in terms of his ability to come through a crisis. We've never seen Charles Martin come through a crisis. One thing that Charles Martin has proved, which Joshua hasn't proved as a pro, is that Charles Martin can go rounds. I believe Charles Martin's been at least, I'm not sure if he's been a distance. He may have been a distance. I know he's gone at least 10 rounds before and stopped a guy in the 10th. So he's shown he can carry power late and still get the job done in the, advanced stages of a fight. So both guys are untested. Both guys, to some extent, are unknown quantities. And that's kind of what is the reason why Joshua and his team decided to take this fight, because they're not going in there with an experienced champion. Yeah, Martin has more fights than Joshua, but he hasn't been fighting at a particularly good level. He hasn't been fighting any level of opposition any better than Joshua's been fighting. So in that sense, they're kind of on an even keel as fighters, and they're both kind of stepping into the unknown, and we're going to find out a lot more about both of them in the fight. So yeah, those are my final thoughts. Those are my thoughts on the weigh-in. It's interesting, isn't it? The fact that Charles Martin actually weighs a pound more than Joshua, even though you look at the bodies of the two of them, and Charles Martin appears to have much more fat on his body and far less muscle. And Joshua, appears to have far less fat and far more muscle, when we know muscle weighs more than fat. So where is that weight coming from in Charles Martin? Did he have something in his pockets? Is Joshua's bone density just not, or his bones just not that dense? Dylan White said this in the lead up to his fight with Joshua. He called Joshua a skinny bodybuilder. And I've always had the impression that Joshua is quite a slender guy naturally. He's not a skinny guy. He's not a Deontay Wilder naturally. But I think he is quite a slender guy. He's not a guy that is naturally really thick set, in my opinion. I don't think so. If you look at, for example, Lennox Lewis, when he was Anthony Joshua's age, Lennox Lewis wasn't a guy who was into doing weights. And by Anthony Joshua's age, Lewis was about maybe 235 pounds, somewhere around there. So he was lighter than Joshua. But in my opinion, he was naturally heavier, naturally bigger than Joshua. I think Joshua was quite a slim guy. And I don't believe all this stuff that Joshua claims that he don't do weights and all that. I mean, I just think that's total nonsense. There is so much video of him online doing weights. I don't know why he tries to maintain that he don't do any weightlifting. He does plenty of weightlifting. And, you don't necessarily have to do a lot of weightlifting to have a physique like Joshua's. There are some people who are just naturally built like that. But in the case of Joshua, I think a lot of it is to do with weightlifting or resistance training at the very least. The part of the reason that he has that. So being a naturally kind of slender guy, which I think he is, particularly you can tell in his legs, he's more naturally slender. Maybe he don't have the bone density of a Charles Martin, who Martin, by the way, is quite a slender guy himself. If you see pictures of him a few years ago, there was nothing of the man. He looked like similar to Deontay Wilder. So it really is kind of puzzling how Charles Martin is actually a pound heavier than Joshua. Weird, isn't it? But anyway, let me stop waffling on about that. The weigh-ins happened. Let me know what you think about everything I talked about in this video in terms of, has Joshua got gassed? Is his ego overinflated now? Is he overlooking Charles Martin? Will he walk onto a big left hand and end up on the canvas, and the Joshua dream, the Joshua story comes crashing down to reality? If it did, to me, it would be an unnecessary setback in his career, because you can do it the right way the first time around. But sometimes, for whatever reason, you don't. And it takes a devastating loss to actually get your career on the type of path it should have been on in the first place. And a perfect example of that was Lennox Lewis. Lennox Lewis was with a trainer early on in his career called John Davenport, who was a fairly competent trainer, but Lewis broke from John Davenport because he was too militaristic. He was like a drill sergeant. And Lewis, being, kind of egotistical guy himself, he didn't like that. So he had a guy called Pepe Correa, who's a Puerto Rican trainer who worked with Sugar Ray Leonard in the latter stages of Leonard's professional boxing career. And Pepe Correa not a really good trainer in my opinion, more of a motivator and a cheerleader. And Lewis stuck with him for several fights until he lost to Oliver McCall. And after the Oliver McCall fight, that's when Lewis got hold of Emanuel Steward, hired him, who ironically had actually trained McCall to beat Lewis. So he, he thought, why not train a guy who engineered my defeat? I'll hire him because he knows all my flaws and he knows what I need to correct. So he hired Manny Steward, and from there on, for the rest of his career, he stayed with Manny Steward. So it took that loss to McCall for him to get the trainer that he should have had in the first place. Could something like that be happening to Anthony Joshua tomorrow night? Because I've always said that I'm not particularly impressed with Tony Sims as a trainer. Some people say that Robert McCracken is actually Joshua's trainer behind the scenes. I don't know. But either way, I would like to see Joshua with a different, more experienced trainer. And it probably will take a loss, a devastating loss, for that to actually happen. Anyway, let me know what you think about everything I talked about in this video. It's your boy Hatman. I'm out.